So why don't we get started? I'm sure folks will trickle in, and but we might as well just get the ball rolling. So I wanted to first off thank everybody for coming today. My name is Ani Kardashian. I'm an assistant professor of medicine at USC and one of the co-founders of the GALS with Jihane Benhammou. So tonight we're going to be holding a panel discussion on leadership skills and advancement in academics and in medicine. And we have two really incredible panelists who have become very prominent leaders within gastroenterology and medicine in general, and who've graciously agreed to share their career experiences. We have Dr. Raman Muthusamy and Dr. Lynn Connolly who are here. Jihane, do you mind jumping to the next slide? And before we more formally introduce them, I just wanted to say a quick word about GALS. This is an organization that Jihane and I started in 2019 when we were GI fellows. It really started, you may have just heard me talking about this, but it really started after seeing how underrepresented women are both in GI within our own communities as well as nationally. And our goal has really been to create to promote career development, networking, and mentorship for women in GI and hepatology in Southern California and in California, more broadly, and to create opportunities to empower and advance women within GI and hepatology. So this is our fourth event. Our board has grown to include both faculty and trainees. So I just wanted to introduce each member of our group who has been integrally involved in planning this event. So first, I'd like to introduce Jihane Benhammou. She's an assistant professor of medicine at UCLA. We also have Winnie Condon here, who recently completed her general GI fellowship at UCLA and is now an interventional endoscopy fellow at UCLA. Adrienne Lenhart, who unfortunately could not be here today, but recently completed her general GI fellowship and has joined the faculty at UCLA. And Camille Soroudi, who's a first-year GI fellow at UCLA as well. And with that, I'll pass it along to Jihane just to go over some housekeeping items before we begin and introduce our panelists.
Great, thank you, Ani. Just want to echo the big welcome to everyone on the call this evening. It's really nice to see familiar faces and new people each time we hold one of these events. So a couple of housekeeping slides here. So I think we all know the Zoom etiquette by now after 2 years and within the pandemic, but here are the two ways you can mute and unmute your computer as well as turn on your camera, and feel free to turn on your camera to ask questions, to participate. This is supposed to be very informal. If you do want to ask a question, please do so. You can post the questions in the chat and one of us will moderate the session. Just be aware that everybody can see the question when you post it. And we would kindly ask everyone if you wouldn't mind to put their name in the participant list. And this is mostly to keep track of who has been coming to the events. This also helps with funding, so we appreciate that. And then I'd like to thank the Salix Pharmaceuticals who have sponsored tonight's event and will be sponsoring future events of the GALS. So with that, I will turn it over to Winnie, who will introduce Dr. Muthusamy.
Thanks, Jihane. So welcome, everybody. I'm Winnie Condon. As Ani mentioned, I just finished my gastroenterology fellowship at UCLA, and I'm currently the advanced endoscopy fellow here as well. And it is my sincere pleasure to introduce our first panelist today, Dr. Raman Muthusamy. He really does not need any introduction, but I'm going to try my best to share with you some highlights of his exceptional career. Dr. Muthusamy is an internationally recognized leader in advanced endoscopy. His clinical research interests focus on endoscopic ablative techniques for Barrett's esophagus, for dysplasia and early adenocarcinoma. He's also very much interested in endoscopic ultrasound and ERCP, with a particular interest in cholangioscopy. He's published more than 350 manuscripts and abstracts and is the editor of the Clinical Gastrointestinal Endoscopy textbook. He's currently the medical director of endoscopy at UCLA, was previously the director of GI fellowship at UC Irvine, and the director of endoscopic ultrasound at UCSF. I'm particularly excited to have him join us for our discussion today because, as I mentioned, I'm currently the Advanced Endoscopy Fellow at UCLA and have been fortunate enough to have firsthand experience with his exceptional ability to mentor women in GI. As many of you know, women would make up the vast minority in advanced endoscopy, with only 13% of all the matched fellows in 2019 being women. In contrast to that, over the past 5 years at UCLA, of the past 5 advanced endoscopy fellows, I'm proud to say that 3 of them, including myself, have been women. And I think that is a true testament to his drive to promote gender equity in GI. So with that being said, it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Muthusamy to our discussion today. Thank you for being here.
Great. Thank you so much. And it's a real honor to be invited to be part of this panel tonight. Thank you.
Camille.
All right. Thanks so much. Just wanted to say I'm Camille Soroudi. I'm a first-year GI fellow at UCLA, and I'm so excited to have 2 incredible panelists and respected leaders here with us tonight. I wanted to take a moment to briefly introduce one of our panelists, Dr. Lynn Connolly, who is currently an associate clinical professor of medicine within the UCLA Division of Digestive Diseases. She's also the gastroenterology section chief at UCLA Santa Monica and a clinical chief for the UCLA Division of Digestive Diseases community practice sites. Dr. Connolly, she graduated from Stanford University with a Bachelor of Science in Biology and a minor in History. She then went on to complete her medical school training at NYU before returning to Stanford to complete her internal medicine residency. Dr. Connolly then completed her GI fellowship at UCLA, where she was also a star fellow in the research program. After graduating fellowship, she accepted a faculty position at UCLA Santa Monica before becoming the director of clinical affairs for the community practices, and again is currently the acting gastroenterology section chief at UCLA Santa Monica and a clinical chief for the community practice sites. Thank you so much, Dr. Connolly, for being with us here tonight.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I was also very honored to be included.
And with that, I think I can start us off with a question, but again, please feel free to post any questions you may have, and I think this will sort of naturally develop into a conversation as it has in the past. But one of the things I wanted to ask is perhaps one of the reasons, and we can discuss whether or not people feel that's true, that women are underrepresented in leadership positions is that they may not feel that they can promote themselves. And I think one of the common things that I've heard from women is that we tend to wait until we're very qualified to be able to apply for a certain position, as which might be very different than how men see themselves in terms of applying for the same leadership positions. So I just wanted to pose that to our panelists and see what your thoughts were.
I can go. It's funny because there's something called the Imposter Syndrome, which I think prevents a lot of women from promoting themselves. And it's this feeling of inadequacy because you think that maybe you can't do your job. And I had to laugh because when I first got this invitation, my first thought was, oh, I shouldn't be on this panel. Why are they possibly including me? What could I possibly have to say? And that's just like a classic self-imposed gender bias. So I think that we do sometimes as women have a harder time promoting ourselves because we may feel that we are not skilled. We may have our own kind of self-imposed gender bias. And we may feel that we need to have every single job characteristic, every single requirement before we can promote ourselves or apply. I also see a lot of times women, like this just happened recently, where someone was thinking they wanted a leadership position, but then they found out that one of their male partners was also interested in applying for the same leadership position. So she told me, I don't know, I'm not going to bring it up now because, you know, I don't know, maybe he should get it. So I think there's a lot of different reasons why women sometimes have a hard time. And the last one is a lot of times when women promote themselves, they can be labeled as aggressive. And I can't tell you how many times I've had a woman be labeled as aggressive for just being self-promoting and being, you know, really out to fight for something. And so I think that we have to be, a lot of times women have a much more narrow range of how they can promote themselves that is felt to be acceptable. And so we're kind of up against all of those barriers.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are all excellent points. I mean, I would just say, obviously, I don't have that perspective, but you know, what I would say is that you should always be your biggest advocate and champion, because really no one's going to believe in you more than yourself, except maybe if you're fortunate to have a super mentor, which I think we may talk about later. I think it's very important, particularly early in your career, to get moving. I think it's very important to do that, and I do think that you know, even if you try, it was interesting. Like if you think, well, there's someone else in the group that may be more, simply just going through the process, going through the applications, the interviews, getting yourself known. You might be, you know, the first runner-up, maybe the top candidate for the next thing that comes up, right? So I think it's important to get in the game, and I think it's you know, it's unfortunate that sometimes if you're viewed as being you know, eager or open to sort of taking on positions, that some may find that aggressive. You know, that's not right. But I'd still highly encourage, you know, applying for things that you're interested in, and even if you don't get it, I think it'll be useful experience going forward for future positions.
Absolutely. I think that, you know, on one hand, while we may face a lot of potential biases or self-imposed bias or different kind of viewpoints, when women do try to promote themselves, there's just as much data that shows that if, as a female or man, you fail to promote yourself and you fail to promote your own interests, then there's going to be less female leaders. And female leaders are needed to help increase the future of other female leaders. So basically, like Raman said, you have to find a mentor, or even better than a mentor, a sponsor, someone who's willing to fight for you, and to just kind of help encourage you so that you do go for whatever role you feel like you might even think you could, you might meet the qualifications for.
Thank you. I have another question I'm interested to hear your opinions. So oftentimes when we have these meetings, it's usually women speakers, and you know, we have them share their experiences and kind of a lot of the things that are mentioned resonate with the group. But we often wonder if men are actually aware or recognize these biases, especially in at the level of leadership against women. And I would be curious to hear from you, Dr. Muthusamy, if along your career you've noticed or you've witnessed biases against women, and what we might be able to do to combat those.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, this kind of gets into a little bit about, you know, there's leadership obviously in different forms, right? There's leadership within your institution. There's leadership in national institutions. You know, I'll maybe talk a little bit about national societies, because I'm heavily involved in the 3 societies. I think I'm currently, at least recently, I was on 7 committees between the 3. So I kind of know a little bit about how some of these things work. And a lot of it's just who you're familiar with, right? So who's there, who you've worked with, and it becomes a small crew, right? And it's like, oh, let's have such and such. And so if you're not part of that group, it becomes harder to break in, right? Because people tend to go with who they're familiar with, right? That's sort of a bit of a trend. It's hard to consider an outsider. Now, I will say this, I think there's probably never been a better time to be a woman applying for a leadership position than right now, because I don't think there's ever been as much of a focus on this as there is right now. Hopefully it'll continue and even expand in the future, but I think it's certainly better than it has been. But a lot of these things, you know, you may just say, oh, we work with this person on this committee or that committee. And so that's where it's important to get involved, get in the game, be seen, volunteer for things. I think that's very important in terms of perhaps being considered for some of these kinds of positions. And I think the same rule probably even applies within your institution as well. getting to know the institutional leadership. If you've never met, the leadership of, your division or your hospital or whatever, it's not reasonable to expect them to tab you to be part of something that initiative they're looking to do, right? So, so I think that's a fairly easy opening step.
I think there are definitely some, I think at UCLA, I can speak because I work with a lot of men in leadership, and I would say within our division, I do think that there is more awareness. I've certainly worked in other situations where there's frequent microaggression, I would say, these like little teeny comments that people will make. Like when you get introduced by your first name and someone else who's a man gets introduced by their last name, or someone makes a comment about, oh, she's going on maternity leave again, or, who should be the secretary? Oh, let's have, Lynn do it. So like a lot of these like little microaggressions, but I will say, I think for me, one of the ways that I've been able to be successful is that whether they're aware of it or not, people like Raman and Eric and a lot of the male leaders are much more aware of this, I would say, than potentially in other work environments. So if you feel that that is an issue wherever you are, it's probably helpful to seek out not just a female mentor or sponsor, but a male mentor or sponsor, because like Raman said, if you're not in the group, it's hard to break in. And if no one in the group looks like you, and I think this goes beyond just gender, it goes with people of color. If there's affinity bias, like if you don't look like everyone else in the group, it's going to be harder for them to view you as the same. And so find people and basically counter that by just having enough different people who are enough different that everyone's bias kind of balances each other's out a little bit.
Thanks so much, Dr. Connolly and Dr. Muthusamy. I think that learning a little bit about your own backgrounds as well and your own experiences can help others who are kind of starting the steps of their either training or career process. Was wondering if you would both be willing to share or describe sort of your own career journeys and kind of how you got to where you are today professionally, particularly if you ever experienced or witnessed any setbacks or barriers that you had to overcome that can be helpful to the rest of us.
Yeah, sure. I grew up in a very small town in South Dakota, 3,500 people. Like Lynn, I went to Stanford, which was a big jump, obviously. And then I went to med school in Seattle and Duke, and I was at UCSF for my fellowship. I went to UC Irvine actually as part of my third year. I was lucky. I didn't actually do a fourth year. I actually did my fourth year and my third year, and then joined the faculty. But my first 4 or 5 years, I didn't really have a mentor, and it became pretty clear to me that the institution really wasn't that interested in supporting what I was doing. They just needed to have someone sit in a chair to say to do that. So I would say that I was highly unproductive in my first 5 years. Probably the only thing I did smart is that I got a clinical research degree, which forced them to make my endoscopy blocks more coordinated, so I wasn't running around trying to just find a spot wherever I could. And it just kind of goes to show you that then I moved to Irvine because they had an opening there. And there I was given an opportunity to take on a little bit of a leadership role. I ran the GI fellowship. They'd had a not so positive survey. And so there was a request for a change in leadership by the fellows. And so I was kind of the outsider who just had arrived, who was kind of younger, and they said, we want that guy. So I ended up taking the job, and we were able to, I think improve the fellowship substantially. We got a full 5-year review. That was literally the last thing I did there before I came to UCLA. And then 10 years ago, I came to UCLA as director of interventional endoscopy. And then for the first time, I actually had the resources and time to sort of do, some research. And I'd been interested in research, but I never really had the infrastructure, the background. And I'll talk about the colleagues. I developed some colleagues working through national societies And, you know, to give you an idea, in my first 10 years before I came to UCLA, I think I had 14 publications. And in the 10 years I've had since then, I've had 165 publications. So, so it's 12x, and that's because it's the same guy, but it just goes to show you that the same person in different surroundings, and surroundings matter a lot. So it's not, you know, I wouldn't internalize it. Sometimes if things aren't going right, you know, you really have to ask yourself why. It may not be you. It just may be that you don't have the resources, the time, the appropriate colleagues, you know. So I think that's probably one of the things that I wasn't brought here to really do research. I was brought here to kind of improve the clinical volume and so forth. But I had this interest on my own, and actually probably the thing I'm probably the most satisfied about is that increase more than anything else. So, and so it's kind of funny now. I pretty much annually exceed what I did in a decade every year now. So, you know, it just once you get rolling, you get better writing, you get doing things, it just becomes easier and easier. So I think that for me, it's been an evolution. I started off sort of with a lot of, you know, hindrances. I didn't have endoscopy time. I didn't have equipment. I didn't really have that. Nobody really cared what I was doing, frankly. And then I became sort of, I got an opportunity to do some leadership things at UC Irvine, which kind of made me start thinking I could maybe do more leadership things. And then I got an opportunity to sort of build a group and run something bigger. And so that's a little bit about my evolution over the past, 20 years.
Great. I do not have those publications. But so my background, so I grew up in in Orange County, and then I also went to Stanford. I actually worked as a healthcare consultant for a year after college before I went to med school, because everyone, goes into consulting or iBanking or medicine back in 2000. Decided I hated commuting and working behind the desk. So I thought I'd go to med school where I would never have to work on a computer until Epic came along. So I went to New York, and then I came back to Stanford for residency. Thought I was actually going to stay in that area, but then I met my husband, moved down to LA, did fellowship here, and I did a master's in clinical research, thinking that I would stay as a clinical educator, but also be able to use that background to help teach fellows and residents and be involved. I was fortunate in that pretty early in my fellowship, I knew that I wanted to stay. So I made what turned out to be a very good decision by being very vocal pretty early on that I'd like to stay and what kind of career I wanted. And I think that really helped set the stage for at the time, Dr. Gitnick and Dr. Israelian to kind of know that I was planning on being here for the long run. And then I started my my clinical career at Santa Monica, where I still am. And then during this time, around the time where Raman joined, I became an attending. UCLA just really pushed out into the community. So it went from just Westwood and Santa Monica to, over a pretty quick period, having places from Torrance to Westlake Village, all the way up to Santa Clarita. And since then we filled in and we have all these different community sites. So I felt that there was a role that hadn't been created yet. And so, someone advised me, you can sit around and wait for someone to acknowledge how awesome you are and then offer you something. And sometimes that happens, but a lot of times it doesn't. So if you feel like there's something that you want or a role that doesn't exist, but you think could exist, you can try to go out and create it. So I pitched that idea to Dr. Gitnick and Dr. Israelian, and they were very supportive. And that's kind of how my role and Kevin's role kind of started. And then of course, as we've grown as a division and as a healthcare system, that role has grown with it. So I feel like I've been very fortunate to end up in the position that I am. And I think it had something to do with me being very open in the beginning with my goals, and also finding mentors who were supporting me, and then finally being able to kind of take the jump and the risk and ask to create a role that may not have existed.
So just as a follow-up to both of those, and thank you both for talking about your journeys. It's kind of interesting to hear where you're both coming from and how you got into these leadership positions. You know, I think often in medicine, we're not trained to be leaders. You know, we're trained to take orders, we're trained to listen to other people and to be told what to do. So I'm curious about how you both, you know, throughout your careers have developed those leadership skills. Was it sort of just, you know, getting your feet wet and jumping into those roles and just kind of learning about it? Or were there, you know, is it something about your consulting background, Dr. Connolly? Is it some, you know, just sort of curious as to what skills you have both felt have helped you to sort of take on these leadership roles? And then also, you know, what has been most challenging about, you know, managing people?
Raman, you want to go first, or?
Well, I'll let you go ahead. I think you manage more people than I do, so.
There's a lot of people. Managing people is challenging. So I think the first question was how I, you know, learned how to be a manager, and it's an ongoing process. It's really interesting. I remember one of the things that I heard very early on was, oh, you know, the people who are the most productive or the best endoscopists or the best clinicians are the people that you should promote to be the leader. And in certain roles, that probably makes a lot of sense. But managing people and negotiating and kind of fighting for things can be a very different skill set than being, you know, the highest score on you know, your tests or your exams, or how great you are doing colonoscopies. So I would say that the thing that I've done that's helped the most is actually read. So I just try to read books on managing and read books on negotiating and read books on leadership. I've had, you know, I ask Eric gives me some ideas. Most of my friends went to business school and my husband, so I, you know, reached for them to get ideas. So I think that reading has really helped tremendously. And then also reaching out to my friends who are managers or leaders in non-medicine, because it's a very similar skill set and they have more official training, you know, than I've had. So that's, and then obviously on the job experience, definitely made a number of mistakes in every aspect of this, that you quickly learn from that. As far as what's hard about leadership is several things. So one is, I think in order to be an effective leader, you have to be passionate about what you're doing and the people. And so that really requires finding meaning in what you're doing. You know how we always used to say, oh, medicine's a calling. Well, what's a calling? Calling is meaning. And so that can be hard. You can kind of get lost in that and just kind of get, you know, negative and focus on the details, and you can lose that. And that's very important. And I think another thing is managing energy. So I think that things can be very draining when you're a manager. People yell at you a lot. People are pissed at you all the time. It can be very draining. So you have to kind of manage your energy, and you have to figure out what are the things that bring you joy and build you up, and what are the things that, you know, just drain you. So for example, my inbox drains me. So I do that in little sections, and then I do the things that I like doing, like talking to my doctors and talking to people, and make sure that I spread that out. I think the final thing I have a hard time sometimes doing is always trying to frame something in a positive way. So not like positive thinking, like, oh, could be worse, I could be in the ICU with COVID, but just trying to frame whatever situation and help the people that I'm working with frame the situation in a positive way. So acknowledging all the crap or whatever it is, but trying to frame it in a way like, okay, but this is how we're going to deal with it. Because again, that brings up energy, that makes people feel that they have more meaning. It makes people feel more loyal and more engaged in their role. And I feel like if I can do that, then I'm usually more successful as a manager.
Those are all great points. I mean, I think that, you know, a good leader or a good manager is, I think, first of all, got to have some vision. What are you trying to do? What's the goal? What are you trying to get to? Because if you don't know where you're trying to go, how are you going to get there? So you have to have a plan in terms of what you hope to achieve. And then I think you have to be, somewhat tough, and not in a bad way. Let me define what I mean by tough is that you're willing to fight the battles that need to make your vision a reality, right? There's, whether it's financial resources, like give me, because everybody's competing sometimes for things. Why should you get it and someone else, So you have to really kind of lay out the rationale for those sorts of things. I think the most important thing is that someone who has the greater good in mind, as opposed to their individual good. So, I think that, at least personally, I try to do what's best for our interventional group, what's best for the team, and as opposed to necessarily what may be best for me. It's not always, sometimes we're competing things, but I think a good leader tries to, at least the vast majority of the time, make the call for the greater good. So I think those are, some general things. I mean, for me, in terms of, getting leadership opportunities, I mean, I think that, in addition, I guess I thought about this. This might lead into something else, but, I think that in the world that we live in, everybody talks about teaching, research, clinical practice, and then you can throw an administration in there. And those are kind of the classic four. But I think there's 3 X factors that you can use to kind of get yourself into leadership. One is societies. There's a lot of opportunities in societies to be on committees. This is a great way to meet people you might not normally meet, big names in the field who might, work with you on a committee paper or something like that. If, in my field, there's a lot of opportunities to work in industry, and I've done a lot of work in industry, and a lot of those industry things have led to society things. They all sort of getting linked in. And, I think a lot of you are much better on this third thing than I am, but I'm sort of realizing its power is social media. And I think that there is a lot of opportunity to publicize your work, so let people know who you are, and get opportunities to, be seen in ways by people that you would normally not be seen. So, and these may give you other opportunities. So I think that, there's these sort of 3 other things that can sort of lead to opportunities, in those classic 4 areas. But I think that in general, if you're interested in doing something, I would say yes and see where it goes. And if you don't like it, you can stop doing it. And if you do, you can keep going.
Thank you for sharing those thoughts. The next question I have sort of ties in with some of the themes that we've been discussing, which is, I heard the word negotiating, promoting, right? And one, I think, topic that comes up a lot is just pay differences. So there's a paper that was recently published in JAMA, which I'll put the link in the chat for other people to get access to. And they clearly show within subspecialties how there is a pay difference between men and women. So, statistics show that there's about an equal number of men and women that go into medical school. And actually, I think that number is now higher for women than men. But in the subspecialty field, it's only 21% in GI, in cardiology, 30% in GI, and even less, as Winnie was mentioning earlier. And when you start to look at the pay differential between men and women, there's clearly a difference there. And so how do you even, start that conversation? And if you are going to promote yourself and ask for, a raise or a promotion, when is a good time to do that? And I guess, how do you ensure that there's sort of an equal playing field between men and women? People don't like to talk about salaries, but I think people think about it a lot.
Well, I'll maybe start with this, since I've had to do this a few times. So I think the nice thing about, certainly working in public institutions is you can find out what everybody makes, right? So I know what every advanced endoscopist in the UC system makes, and I know where I rank, and I use that to my advantage. So I also know what my friends make, and I also have a pretty good idea. So I know what the market rate is, and I think I would highly encourage you guys to know that as well. And you should know what it is for someone who is of comparable stature at other institutions, right? So even if it's a male, you'll say, hey, I've got exactly the same CV as this person, but I know they make X. And I think you can go back and make a strong argument for that. I don't think you should be, you should hesitate to do that. I'm actually very open about doing that. So What's harder to do is to kind of prove your worth. The world now is so RVU based that, you know, you do this and so forth. And the hospital certainly makes it very difficult for you to show how much you bring in. You know, I had to pull teeth to sort of 5 years ago, one of our fellows who's an MBA found out how much money we brought into the healthcare system from outside referrals for EUS. And it took me about, it took a lot of work, but it turns out it's about just EUS outside is 10 million a year. That's just a fraction. So I have a rough idea what our program brings in, and so I can kind of use that as leverage. But I think it's important for you not to, it's very important to know exactly what you bring, know what the market rate is, know what, you know, MGMA has nice tools. If you've used this MGMA calculator, which will tell you what, if you do 7,000 RVUs, what's the national average in salary for that? So there's indirect ways that you can find out what things may be, at least to know what a fair market rate is. Now, of course, getting that from your own institution is based on a lot of local factors, so I can't, but at least you'll know what it roughly should be, and then you can decide. And then, you know, I think it's important to show the other things that you bring in terms of negotiating. I think one thing is creating a good culture. I mean, one of the things that, you know, I was brought in to do, because the history of them was primarily a lot of individual endoscopists, but never a team. And so part of what I was brought in to do was build a team, not just have one person like the next person sitting in a chair. And so if you can show that you've built a program or a team, those are, you know, maybe not individually financially beneficial to you, but there's certainly value to the institution. Or if you're a great teacher, or if you've brought in large research funds, or you know, other kinds of things. So there's lots of different ways to show your value. Some are monetary, but many are not. But I would certainly keep tabs of them, and don't be afraid to share the importance and value of them when you do negotiate.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that data is the most helpful thing that you can have. And so preparing in advance, especially if you have the tendency to underplay your value, or might be quick to say, oh yeah, okay, that sounds fair, even if you don't think that that is fair. So prepare, have the data, and then, you know, we need to help each other too. So, you know, you need to be open with other people, and they need to be open with you in order to get some of that data. So some of the data, like Raman said, is out there for you to get, and other data you may need to form relationships and engage other people both in your institution and outside in order to get that. And what I also want to echo what Raman said about it's not just about like a number or a salary or how much you bring in, but thinking about what other skill sets that you bring. So for example, early on, like very early, like my very first year, for example, or second year or something, like I put together data and a graph in the PowerPoint about how long patients were waiting to see me, to basically make the point of like, hey, we need more women, and I'm valuable because people are waiting to see me, and they could be seen by X, Y, and Z in the next week, but they're waiting 3 or 4 weeks to see me. So that kind of data, you know, is just one example of, you know, kind of going out there, but it made a point. So there's kind of the classic numbers and salaries and, oh, I have the same CV, but then there's also what makes you an individual and what makes you not replaceable. And don't be afraid to advocate for yourself. Like, just sometimes like people say like, just pretend you're like a man. Like, what would they say? They would just go in and be like, I'm, you know, whatever. And I'm not saying all men do that, and a lot of women do that, but sometimes in the back of my head, that's honestly what I say. I think of someone who would just like go in there and just like sell themselves. And I say, I'm just gonna pretend to be that person, and I'm just gonna go say what I'm worth or what I want or what I think needs to happen.
Thank you both for that advice. I think it's really helpful for people who are trying to advance in their careers to kind of know where they stand and be vocal about what their worth is. This is tangential to that as well. But for people who are earlier in their career, maybe geared more towards trainees or fellows or people who are just starting their career, When do you think is a good time to start negotiating? And especially if you're so much early in your career that you might not have as much tangible experience with your employer, being able to show or prove, this is my worth. Do you think that it's something people start right off the bat, or a year or two of experience under their belt?
I think it just depends on what you're negotiating for. So for example, if you're applying to UCLA or Kaiser, there's not really a lot of negotiation. There's like a standard offer letter, and there's really like straight off the bat, that's kind of it. For like your average general GI position in a place like Kaiser or UCLA or a lot of these academic institutions. Private practice or other institutions where there might be some room to negotiate, that's different. So I would say, if you know though what you want early on in your career, then you should not be shy with voicing that, and I'm sure Raman can talk about getting into societies and joining committees, but basically putting yourself out there as a fellow. If you know, hey, this is what I want to do. I want to be an interventional fellow, or I want to stay in this academic center and specialize in IBD, or whatever it is. Be vocal about that, find the leaders in those areas, and then try to just get involved in whatever groups or committees or training might be necessary. So I think it's less potentially about negotiating your self-worth during training as much as it is trying to figure out what it is that you want and identifying the people and the strategy that can best get you there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that professionally you tend to live your life in 3 to 5 year blocks, and then sometimes you renew and sometimes you move, and different things. And the professorial track is usually about every 6 years in the UC system. I'm not, privates are similar, 6 to 8 years. So I think if you're just starting, as Lynn mentioned, a lot of places, especially when you're coming out, and especially if you're coming to a large institution, the opening offer is the opening offer, and you just basically take it or leave it. So you might be able to make some small changes here and there, but in general, there's probably not a huge amount of flexibility. But I think where the flexibility may start coming is when you get higher up, and at 3 to 5 years. And I hate to say it, but every single person I know who's gotten a big jump got a big jump because they had an outside offer. And I wish it wasn't true, but big institutions need a gun to their heads before they really start putting the money out. And I don't know one person who's ever gotten something big that didn't have an outside offer that led to it. So, and unfortunately, that's the way of the world, it seems. But I do think that if you do have an outside offer, I will say this about negotiating. If you do have an outside offer and then you want to come back with your goal of negotiating to stay, you should be prepared to take the outside offer. You never know how it's going to work out, so don't float an offer that you're not going to take, because if you end up staying and then don't get it, then it's going to be very hard to get anything in the future. I know a couple of people who've done that too. So I do think that obviously try to build your case. I'll just openly share. I just finished 10 years at UCLA, and I had a plan for the next 10 years, and I had a 50-slide PowerPoint that I took to my division chief, and I told him what I wanted, and I said I want a meeting with the CEO and the vice chancellor, and he got it for me, and I made my presentation for a new unit, and I laid out all the data for 10 years, including the number of cases we did every month by type for 10 years, because I had all that data, as Lynn was talking about. And I sort of built the case for why we need the resources. And, we'll see. UCLA is a complex place, but we got a positive reaction, certainly, at least initially. So I think a lot of it is data, building your case, sharing a vision, I think. And then I think one thing that's very important is, despite the frustrations, and I think Lynn is really great at doing this, is keeping a positive outlook. People like to work with positive people. People like to work with problem solvers, not complainers. And so, if you're one of these people that identifies an issue, perhaps identify the solution too, and then maybe take the lead on how to do it. So I think these are ways that you can make yourself viewed favorably among leadership. So those are some general things that have in my life that I've found useful to kind of do these kind of negotiations.
And even if you don't have another offer, if you have enough confidence in yourself to know that you could get another offer. So when it became pretty clear that I wanted to do what I wanted to do, I hadn't started another job search yet. So I actually didn't have, I also don't have as big of a jump as what Raman's talking about, obviously, but I knew that I wanted to do something like this in my career. And so I had the confidence to know that if I was told no, I could walk away and I could find another job. So even if you don't have another job, if you're not happy in wherever you are, or you want something, if you make that clear, you know, and it might be that they say, sorry, it can't happen, in which case, great, you know, you can find yourself another job. They might say, I think I can, I need some time, I need to work on it. And that might be an opportunity where then you go find that other offer, or you double down on them and say, okay, I hear that. This is my timeline. I'm going to, you know, perhaps we could circle back and meet again in a week or a month or 3 months, whatever this timeline is, and then see if they've really moved the needle on you. And if they have, then great. And if not, then you can kind of get a sense of what your options really are. And again, only do that though if you can leave. We've had people, you know, who, and we've all done that, where, you know, you make a play, but then you don't actually have a backup, and then that's not good.
Right. Sometimes the bluff gets called, right, as they say.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's very good. And I think Lynn hit the point that I mentioned earlier, is it starts with a belief in yourself, right? Because you obviously had the self-confidence to know that, look, I'll be fine, right? You know, either way. And so I think that that's always an important first step.
Just as a follow-up to that, you know, I've heard from, you know, other folks that it's important to, you know, be looking at, you know, to always keep your options open, and to, you know, every few years or some amount of time to kind of search and look for other jobs, or just to know what else is out there. So I'm curious as to, you know, if you guys have any thoughts or advice on, you know, like at what point, you know, for folks in their early careers, do you recommend that, you know, that those steps are taken, and like how frequently, you know, do you look to kind of reaffirm your self-worth, and, you know, how you'd sort of approach that?
I think that's really more of a personality and where you get that. So I did that, like when I first started, I used to try to like keep tabs on like where I could get a job. And that didn't actually make me feel happier at my current job, and it didn't really give me any forward direction. So I personally, for me, stopped doing that, just kind of decided that, you know what, if I'm ever not happy, somebody's going to be psyched to get me. Whether or not that's true, who knows? But that's kind of how I chose to go about it. And so I chose to instead just keep focusing on whatever I wanted my next step to be, so that I was happy. But that doesn't work for everyone. And certainly a lot of people, their career that they've chosen, or their financial goals that they've chosen, or their titles, or their resources that they need to do with their job, will probably require them to constantly, you know, look. I will say I try my hardest to keep like my finger on the pulse, so to speak, so I know what's around, not for me personally, but honestly, so that I know how I can hire and how I can retain.
Yeah, you know, I think I agree with Lynn that it's a lot of, sometimes it's your personality type. I have one friend who I think it's a form of entertainment for him to constantly be looking for another job. I don't know why, but it's a lot of work, you know, it's tiring. And, you know, applying this, you know, and I think that, to be honest, I don't recommend it, only because I think if you're trying to be successful at your current job, focus on that and not on something else, right? So I think that, you know, but from time to time, an opportunity, you may hear about something through word of mouth. You might see something posted somewhere. Maybe you'll take a flyer at it because you're interested in it, and I think that's okay. it's good to sort of get a sense when you go through these things, what people are looking for. I think it'll give you an idea about what other people value. You know, if you interview, you'll get a sense of what people are looking for. Oh, you're interested in the fact I did that. I didn't even think that was that important, you know? And so you kind of will be surprised at what people find in your CV that is particularly appealing to them, and what reasons. And sometimes you may be quite surprised by that. So I think it is interesting to do those things, and from time to time, I wouldn't do it routinely. I agree with Lynn. But it gives you an idea of what the market may be. And, you know, sometimes you may do it and realize that you've got it really good. And maybe things are, you know, it's not always greener on the other side. And if you do pop into an excellent situation, then maybe then it becomes a thing where you can either go there or improve your lot at your existing situation. So, but I wouldn't recommend doing it routinely, but occasionally a good opportunity will come up through word of mouth, and you may want to pursue it.
Thank you. Have a question on maybe a little slightly different topic than what we've been talking about, but you know, I think we've sort of discussed and established that there is a lack of females, women in leadership positions, and one of the reasons might be the lack of female women in leadership positions. You know, not being able to see people similar to yourself in those roles. So from your leadership perspective, is it important to necessarily particularly recruit women to leadership roles? Or is it, you know, more important that this be based completely on the right person for the right job, regardless of their gender? Is there a push to sort of bring more women into these positions?
I think it's important to be reminded that medicine and leadership in medicine, like all professions, is not a meritocracy. And that, you know, yes, it's important to provide high level care, but, you know, in order to advance yourself, you've got to be out there. You've got to be like raising your hand, looking for opportunities. And I think that that's kind of the baseline. If you have people like that, I would say for me, I mean, I remember like 2 years or 3 years into starting to hire, I started to laugh. I'm like, wow, I really hire a lot of women. I don't know if I was doing that consciously or unconsciously, probably a little bit of both. But I do think that it is important to hire women. I mean, I think that once I made that realization, I tried to realize like I need to be very aggressively diverse in hiring. Because I think that it obviously goes beyond just hiring women, but it goes to obviously hiring all sorts of types of diversity. So I do think that there's a push, but not just to hire a female to be a female. Again, it's not just like a meritocracy, and just being a female doesn't like give you like a heads up on this like leadership role. Yes, they want women leaders. Yes, they want people of color. Yes, they want all of these things, but not just because of that. Like you can't just be a good doctor and, you know, be a female. Like you've got to actually have the other stuff too. And sometimes you may have to even be stronger than your counterparts. But I will say that there is a push, and I do personally think it's a priority to create a more diverse base, because that's where you get your leaders from.
Yeah, and I you know, I think that for a lot of positions, you know, there's more than one capable candidate, right? It's not always, you know, there's probably, you might interview 10 people and realize that there's 4 people who could probably do this job really well in different ways. And I think that, as Lynn suggested, that you'd like any organization to reflect society. And, you know, where if somebody looks at that organization, it's a reflection of society, it doesn't look different than the world. And, you know, so I think that, you know, I think that there's a certain minimum standard that needs to be met, obviously. But once that's met, then, you know, I think that if 2 people are tied, you know, it may be of advantage to an organization to have, you know, a broad, diverse, you know, leadership panel. I think most companies, most leadership organizations would agree with that and choose to do that. So I will comment on this. There's one of my roles is, you know, there's a paper that there's a women's issue at the American Journal of Gastroenterology that comes out once a year. And I serve as an editor for that journal. And one of the papers that's coming out is exactly this issue about mentorship and women in GI. And I will say that we're making progress. I mean, just a couple of years ago, all 4 societies in GI were run by women. And I think as you said, the medical school is 50-50 now, or maybe even slightly more women. And I think if you take a look at incoming GI fellowship classes, maybe not the field as a whole, that's also getting close to even now, I think. So I think in time you'll see that. I think advanced endoscopy is probably the last most male bastion in the field. And I think even that will, in time will also correct itself. But one thing that this study that came out, it asked a lot of women and male trainees and women and male mentors. And it was interesting because the female mentors, because again, right now we have many more female trainees than we have female faculty. And they cited the pressure to mentor women as a major source of burnout. And one of the things that we actually asked for some revisions on the paper, but one of the things we said is that it really is important to realize that it can't just be women who lead the mentorship role for other women. It has to be men too, right? There has to be, sort of both. It shouldn't be this sort of gender-based thing. And we talked about, we asked them to put a table together of how to do this. So there are some issues that come up in terms of this, and it was interesting to see how much female faculty felt this burden to sort of serve as these mentors, and how detrimental it was. And it was actually leading to unhappiness in their position. So I think that, it is an issue. And I think that certainly, medical school and GI faculty need to be aware of, having the entire faculty try to work on this together.
We have not discussed what I would say is like possibly one of the biggest barriers. I keep waiting for it. And since it's 7 o'clock, I'm just busting out. We've not brought up the fact that like many of the faces, we all have kids and we all have to go on maternity leave. And we all have to pretend to pump or try to pump or maybe pump and not sleep. And then we have to come back from maternity leave and have a bunch of people be like, yeah, I covered for you. And when we're applying for jobs, I mean, I'm just being straight here because this really goes with leadership. Like when you are hiring for like if you're a group and you're hiring, you're like, I could hire this female and she's going to probably go on maternity leave 2 to 3 times, which means I'm going to be on call Q3. And then she's going to want to work part-time. Or I could hire this awesome dude who's clearly going to be the breadwinner and he's never going on maternity leave. And then as the female, you go on maternity leave, you're exhausted. You don't even get to come to one of these panels because your freaking child's sick, or you're like my children, I'm amazed, are not coming in here naked. Also why I'm on Blur. And then, you're like basically kind of not fully engaged for like a period. I'm being straight. And then you're like, oh, gee, I wonder why there's no women leaders. And I wonder why women don't have time to mentor other women. And, I think that we really have to acknowledge that, our training correlates with our, biological clock, and that the policies that were initially created are designed for a male faculty. Like when I breastfed or pumped for my first child, I did it in the cafeteria of Ronald Reagan because fellows had no place to pump. When I was an attending, I bought a little mini fridge and I came from my first day of maternity leave. I'm like, oh, I'm going to pump. And then I had no time and 12 hours went by and I lost all my milk in one day. And that was it. That was the end of my breastfeeding career. And, we have to create as women policies. Like, you guys asked me, what are the personal and professional barriers? I would argue there's a third P, and it's policy. Like we can talk about, like we could promote ourselves and we all have to have and all these things. Believe me, I believe in everything I say and I'm very passionate about. But if we don't create policies that acknowledge that many of the women are also trying to raise children, and if COVID didn't teach us that we have to take more responsibility of childcare and house duties, and women who are professionals are more likely to be married to full-time male or female professionals versus male full-time professionals are much more likely to be married to women who don't work or are part-time. So we hadn't brought it up, and I just want to say that, like, as far as every question that you've asked, I think a major barrier is the lack of, or just the start of, policies to acknowledge that if we want to retain and build women, you know, how can you become a tenured professor if you work part-time? In most places, no. Can you apply for deanship if you're not tenured? No. So there's all of these things. So we just hadn't brought it up. And so before everyone got off, I just wanted to state that, because I do think that that is the elephant in the room. And since this is a bunch of women, I do think that's probably the biggest thing that we as a group, both men and women here, need to really change.
Thanks so much. Sorry. Thank you so much, Dr. Connolly, for saying all of that. I think that was probably really refreshing for a lot of people here to actually hear. And I think we could probably have a whole conversation based upon just that and other, you know, very significant barriers. We are a little bit over our time, so I want to wrap up and let people go. First, I do want to say thank you to both Dr. Connolly and Dr. Muthusamy for being such amazing panelists and leading this discussion. I want to also say thank you to Salix for sponsoring the event, and thank you to PACE, and particularly Megan and Tom and Pablo for helping to coordinate the event. And then lastly, thank you to everybody who took the time on a Wednesday night to come and join us for this conversation. I'm hoping that we can continue these meetings hopefully in person next time. We do plan to have host another similar event at the post AASLD meeting hosted by Southern California Gastro Society in December. So we hope to be able to see you all there.
Thank you all so much for coming.
Thanks for
Thank you.
sharing.